representative from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, here to give us an overview of the world's food situation. Charles Weitz is a native of Des Moines, and I believe his mother and another relative are here. Would you like to stand up, please, so we can recognize you for producing our speaker? Mr. Weitz has been associated with the United Nations almost from the time it was established, I believe. First with UNESCO in its Bureau of Administrative Management and Budget, and then as that bureau's director. Then in 1952, he was deputy director of the Program and Financial Division of the UN Technical Assistance Board. Later, he was the permanent representative for that board in Ankara, Turkey, and in Colombo, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. From UNCTAD, he moved to FAO's Freedom from Hunger campaign shortly after that program was launched in 1960. More recently, he has served as the director of the liaison office of FAO with the United Nations in New York City. Mr. Weitz, we're looking forward to your presentation about FAO's activities related to increasing the amounts and kinds of food available to people around the world.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Dr. Parks, it's a great honor that you can spend a bit of time and stay with us this morning, and I want to salute also the other members, the members of panels and participants at this conference, and to say that it is both a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to be with you today, and I regret to say, Charlotte, only at the very opening, since I have a plane that I must catch to go to the West Coast very shortly, and to be able to look at some of the current world food issues, and particularly the conditions as seen from the perspective of the Food and Agriculture Organization. I cannot as well fail to express my personal pleasure at the circumstances which have allowed me to be here, to be in Iowa, my birthplace, and where the Weitz family still carries on after some 4 generations and 130 years of residence. You've already mentioned a couple of ringers that are in the audience this morning, and I appreciate very much your kindness to welcoming them here with me. Tomorrow is the second World Food Day sponsored by the Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as its 37th anniversary. It is important that the World Food Institute, which has played such an important role in the analysis and exposition of food issues, should again gather leaders to examine and to discuss the challenges and solutions and programs for action. The Institute is doing a great service, regularly and particularly today, for citizens of this community, for this state and this nation, by helping to promote a better understanding of one of the most complex international issues and of the world beyond our borders. I want specifically to salute the Institute for its continuing valuable contribution and for this gathering. Whenever I have the opportunity to speak on world food issues, I am reminded again at both the utter simplicity of the solutions when viewed from the point of view of science and technology, and the complexity of the subject in the context of world political, economic, and social conditions. We can agree, without serious debate, I should think, that people have a right to food, that mankind deserves to be free from hunger, as the Constitution of FAO proclaims. We can subscribe, I hope without reservations, to the Declaration of the United Nations World Food Conference of 1974 on the elimination of hunger as a priority task of our generation. But the road to achieve these objectives is difficult, and often, as we examine the record of the past years since the subject of underdevelopment, food production, malnutrition, and undernutrition have become issues on the front burner, we must be struck by the wide disparity between our knowledge and our understanding of issues and of progress. As a generalization, it is true that as a percentage of total population, as many people suffer from hunger and malnutrition, in the world today as was true 2 decades ago when B.R. Sen, as Director General of FAO, launched the Freedom from Hunger campaign to alert the world to the growing dangers of hunger and poverty. In absolute terms, of course, the numbers have increased. And before turning to some of FAO's views, let me discuss the statistic for just a minute. It has become the subject of much controversy, and I believe it should not be the reason for a sterile debate over numbers. The FAO estimate, and note the word estimate, is that today some 450 to 500 million people are undernourished, about 1 in 10 in the world's population. The World Bank, the USAID, and others use the estimate that 800 million people are too poor to meet their basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. Others, reputable religious organizations and relief groups included, use the figure of 1/4 of the Earth's population, or 1 billion or more people, in desperate need, which includes undernourishment, malnutrition, or outright hunger. Now, despite the large differences in these figures, each is correct as a reflection of a different measurement of hunger or poverty or need. But the crucial point is not the statistical accuracy of any number, but the sheer magnitude of the number, accepting even the lowest FAO estimate. What we know for certain is that hundreds of millions of people on this globe, day after day, do not get enough to eat. Their lives are blighted, their children are denied physical and mental development by this most basic of all privations. Let's look now for a minute at the world food situation. This is a delicate task these days, particularly in this particular location. With falling prices for agricultural products, with bumper harvests, with high rates of interest and increasing costs of most all agricultural input, it takes some temerity to suggest that elsewhere conditions are more unfavorable. And to raise issues of political action and national policy, which are currently being hotly debated or charged and countercharged, takes even perhaps more courage. So I go into these issues as an international civil servant of some years' standing, attempting to reflect the world's situation and the needs and aspirations of the 150 member states within that system. And I am very sorry, I don't know whether any of you heard the President's announcement earlier this morning. I'm sorry I didn't get to hear it. I don't know whether it adds or detracts from what you'll debate today, but others will bring that up at a later time. The world economy has for some years been shaken by a series of crises characterized by persistent inflation, very almost ruinous for some countries, severe currency fluctuations, very high interest rates, growing unemployment, and acute social tensions. Meantime, the world is squandering its resources and losing its soul in a mad arms race. This race does not make for security, either for any one nation or for the world, but to the contrary increases hostility, suspicion, tension, and the risks of wars. The ineffectual second special session of the United Nations General Assembly on Disarmament, held some months ago, reminded the world that it was wasting some $600 billion annually on instruments of destruction and devoting the intelligence, the skills, and the times of hundreds of thousands of people to the design of more and more sophisticated weapons for mass destruction. Alone among all other priorities in national budgets, military expenditures are seemingly immune to any financial limitations. And as a parenthesis, and perhaps to give you a sense of the size and influence of an international organization in the face of the issues which you'll discuss here today, and perhaps to produce a rueful smile, all of the budgets of FAO together since its founding in 1945 would cover a bit less than 1/2 of the cost of one nuclear Trident-type submarine. Looking at the world food situation, it's perhaps a good time to review it, as it illustrates the year-to-year shifts which occur, and at the same time the lack of meaningful change for those chronically hungry. In 1979 and 1980, world food supplies were at the edge of a major crisis again, as had happened in 1973 and 74, with its attendant suffering and death. In both 1979 and 1980, production fell, and people consumed more grain than was produced. While production and reserves were falling, world population increased by some 160 million people. Grain imports of the developing and the food deficits countries rose to 100 million tons in 1980, more than 3 times their 1970 level. And prices paid for imported grains were sharply higher, including transport costs. In 1980, developing countries as a whole spent some $17 billion to buy food for their people, the bulk of this spent in the United States and Canada. This sum was about equal to all of the development assistance those countries received that year, assistance for all purposes, not just food aid. Last year's harvests were very good, and thanks largely to favorable weather conditions. The exception was Eastern Europe and the USSR. World grain production increased by 7% to 1.5 billion tons, so that carryover stocks may total around 270 million tons at the end of the 81-82 season, or 18% of consumption, which is regarded as a minimum for world food security. It is still too early for a final reckoning on the 82 crop, but the forecast now stands at between 1,490 and 1,560 million tons, close to the 1981 crop, but below trend. The main difficulties today even, as you know, are in the USSR and Australia, and perhaps in some Far Eastern countries for rice. One should be pleased with these results, but these overall figures mask important individual problems. In the Near East region, production declined on a per capita basis, while in Africa, it increased by only 2%, well below the 3% population growth. And in the least developed countries as a whole, per capita food supplies decreased by 2% last year. Today, according to FAO's World Information and Early Warning System, some 23 countries are suffering from acute food shortages, and there are additionally some 10 million refugees who require help for daily subsistence. The long-term trend is still very disquieting, particularly in Africa. Just a few days ago, the Director General of FAO issued a further warning that Africa was ill. He pointed out that per capita food production had dropped by more than 10% in the last 10 years, and the daily average dietary energy supplies have been barely maintained at some 6 to 7% below nutritional requirements. The Director General said that agriculture, and especially food production, must be the main concern of all public authorities in Africa, and that Africa's only chances of recovery will come from large increases in domestic food production and a rise in export earnings. He has cautioned that if the declining situation cannot be halted, it will destabilize entire societies and threaten the political and economic independence of the countries in the region. Overall demand for food and agricultural products in the Third World will double by the end of the century, within 20 years. Production will have to grow by some 50 to 60% to sustain a world population of more than 6 billion people, a low population projection on the UN scale. How are we to feed these 2 billion additional people, 90% of whom will be born in the third world countries? Do we receive them with any kind of hope and any kind of promise for life, or do we receive them in conditions which will drive them to revolt? FAO does not pretend to have definitive answers. There is, however, an interesting overlay of advice and solution dating from the earliest days of the organization. If one were to study carefully the outlines for action at the national and local level proposed by FAO's first Director General, John Boyd Orr, in 1946, the resolutions of the First and the Second World Food Congresses called by FAO, and the resolutions of the United Nations World Food Conference in Rome in 1947, one would not find, aside from differences in language and non-critical detail, any basic differences in the main recommendations for action. So, through the process of international compromise and negotiations, governments and non-governmental organizations alike of the world have agreed on the recommendations and the strategies for action. And these have been basically unchanged for 3 decades. Nor is this agreement limited to what's happened within the UN system. The Council of Ministers of the OECD in Paris, the governments meeting in Cancun, the Independent Commission on International Development Issues under the chairmanship of Willy Brandt, the Global 2000 report to the President of the United States, the report of the Presidential Commission on Hunger, the National Academy of Science, and so on and so forth, have all largely been in agreement on the priorities which must be accorded to agriculture and the programs of action to be followed in order to achieve world development and to eliminate hunger and malnutrition. If the hungry could only eat paper, the problem would have been overcome. And so we are left with the conclusion that the lack of sufficient response to these policy agreements and blueprints for action is only a monumental failure of will. FAO recently issued a study called Agriculture Toward 2000. And this has made a prospective analysis of the world food and agricultural trends and possibilities to the end of the century. The paper is not a prediction nor a doomsday document. It offers governments 3 sets of possibilities for development in the agricultural sector, taking into account population, income growth, investment requirement, food production, and other factors. And it sets out alternative policies for moving to higher levels. The first scenario is the trend based merely on the extrapolation of present trends. The number of underfed people would increase from its present level of 450 to 500 million people today to some 600 to 700 million people by the end of this century. The second scenario is more optimistic, and it is based on a 4.5% growth target for gross national products in the developing countries, which in turn would call for an annual 3.7% increase in agricultural production. This is to be contrasted with the 2.9% growth rate of the past decades. In this alternative, the number of malnourished people would drop to about 250 million. The third, more modest scenario assumes agricultural production will increase at a rate of only a little over 3% a year. In this, overall improvement would be limited, but the number of the malnourished people would remain at about their present level, but a considerable reduction in percentage of total. Thus, if things do not change, the scourge of hunger will grow worse. To avoid this conclusion, a whole series of measures is needed. First, stimulation of agricultural production by massive investment programs through mobilizing more national resources and providing more substantial aid from the international community. Second, food security at the world, regional, and local levels must be increased. And third, there must be a liberalization of access to markets of the developed countries and remunerative prices for exports from the developing countries. The first priority, obviously, must go to increased investment in the agricultural sector. Governments of the countries concerned will have to devote a larger share of their current and their long-term capital budgets to agriculture. According to FAO, by the end of the century, annual gross investment in agriculture would have to total between $100 and $130 billion at 1975 prices. This would finance the level of growth that could come close to the 3.7% a year increase of the most optimistic scenario. There are some encouraging signs that third world governments are shifting from their post-independent fixation on industry and urban development to the realization that a strong agriculture and rural society is essential to a generally healthy total society and balanced development. Perhaps no shift in priorities has been more dramatic than that of India, and nowhere is there a clearer example of the results when agricultural education, rural credit, irrigation, electrification, marketing, and advisory services have been upgraded and priority returned to the land and to the bulk of the population which lives on the land. The transformation is far from complete, and India is certainly not out of the woods. But the important conclusion is that national thinking and priorities and programs have changed, and positive results have followed. Foreign assistance will remain an essential part of the investment requirement and will need, according to FAO, at least $12.5 billion by 1990, measured again in constant dollars. While one cannot help but be encouraged by the increased emphasis given on agriculture by the World Bank, by the initial successes of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which was an outcome of the Rome World Food Conference, and increased pledge levels to the World Food Program. And could I stop for just a moment and welcome an old friend and one of the really great international civil servants who was executive director of the World Food Program, Tom Robinson. It's a tremendous pleasure to see Tom here today, and I would like particularly to say welcome to him. There is a rather disquieting trend of disaffection toward international assistance and to the multilateral sector. Public development aid is decreasing in real terms, and that for agriculture, which had seen a clear increase, has been declining in real value since 1979. And yet, in summit after summit, the priority set by world leaders for agriculture has been emphasized. Unfortunately, there also appears to be a slide from the multilateral to bilateral aid, stated to be better in line with national interests, and there is a companion claim also heard these days that salvation lies in the market economy and private enterprise. But who will invest in the poorest countries and in the food sector where profitability is the lowest? In 1980, only 16% of the bilateral commitments of the development assistance countries was devoted to agriculture. A further shift to bilateralism will, FAO believes, reduce even more the already inadequate share of aid to agriculture and rural development. And parallel to this, resources of the International Development Association have been cut by 25%, and a large part of its work was for agriculture and rural development. Both the United Nations Development Program, which devotes normally about 1/3 of its resources to agriculture and rural development, and for the International Fund for Agricultural Development itself, have been suffered cuts of more than 25%. And as I'm sure Tom Robinson knows as well, while pledges to the World Food Program have been increasing, commitments, i.e. the actual delivery of commodities against those pledges, have been declining. The second area for priority action by governments is for world food security. Here again, hopes have been disappointed. Yes, the International Monetary Fund has now provided a new food facility, and the International Food Emergency Reserve, also mandated at the World Food Congress, last year finally reached its minimum target of 500,000 tons of grain, although there is absolutely nothing to indicate that this will happen again this year. But elsewhere, the situation is blocked. Negotiations for a new international grain agreement needed to ensure both market stability and world food security is at an impasse. Lack of resources and readiness on the part of the international community to finance national or regional food security projects prevents the poorest countries from taking advantage of the present good harvests to set up security reserves. No mechanism guarantees the supply for the poor food deficit countries. When harvests are bad, prices soar, and the wealthiest importers are served first. The poor countries are always the losers in this kind of competitive price rationing. Yet the elements of a true food security system are known: national stocks, regional arrangements, price clauses, and a world security reserve, food aid tailored to needs, a satisfactory mechanism for intervention that is dependable and truly multilateral in emergencies. Again, there is no political will to move to this world system, the outlines of which have been agreed. Third, we come to the most thorny and controversial of the areas, international trade relations. For developing countries, the chronic instability of export markets is their major handicap, thwarting their own development programs and checking growth. With inflation remaining high and production costs in these countries rising without let-up, mostly as a result of external factors over which they have no control, their total export revenues stagnate in real value and actually decline, owing to sluggish demand and depressed prices. To buy necessary equipment at increasing prices, these countries have to sell more and more raw materials at lower prices. The situation is particularly difficult for the poor food deficit countries, squeezed between rising import costs for food, fuel, and other basic necessities, and declining prices for their sole export products. How can these countries break this vicious cycle? They have no influence on the market. The prices of their products are determined outside of their countries without reference to production costs or general development of prices for imported products. The international financial market futures exchanges and speculations at times affect the market forces to the advantage of the stronger parties. The practical result is simply that these countries find themselves dispossessed of their only wealth, and the continuous deterioration of terms of trade is progressively impoverishing them. The reality of unequal trading terms has often been hotly contested, like the debate over the numbers of the undernourished. But FAO's recently released Commodity Review and Outlook for the last 2 years clearly illustrates what has been happening. World trade in agricultural commodities in 1981 was marked by a general decline and considerable fluctuation in prices of the principal foodstuffs owing to the recession and to large supplies. An extreme example is sugar, the world market price of which fluctuated from 17 cents a pound in 1979 to just under 40 cents in 1980 and then dropped to 12 cents in 1981. This drop accentuates the long-term trend downward, and in fact, real prices for a wide range of commodities, jute, tea, rubber, bananas, wheat, maize, soybeans, and palm oil, have declined in the past 10 years. The real price, for example, of tea and jute are today barely 1/3 of their value 20 years ago. A ton of bananas buys only half as much steel as 10 years ago. The developing countries' foreign exchange revenues from their agricultural exports decreased in real terms by more than 3% in 1980, and the overall surplus of their agricultural trade balance worsened, falling from $15 billion in 1979 to $6 billion in 1980. No doubt, there was another fall this last year, but final figures are not in yet. Thus, in 1980-81, 20 developing countries had to resort to compensatory IMF financing, and the stabilization fund of the European economic communities were not sufficient to meet transfer requests. Without the stabilization of markets at remunerative prices, and without a liberal policy of access to markets, trade relations will continue against the poor countries. And again, any indication of progress is disappointing. The main international fora for such work is UNCTAD. Its work on the Integrated Program for Commodities has marked time since 1976. Aside from a new rubber agreement and some progress on negotiating a tropical timber agreement, negotiations on other commodity arrangements have been without result, and few of the existing arrangements are operating satisfactorily. FAO's role in any of these international negotiations is to provide the technical studies on which the negotiations are continuing, particularly in UNCTAD for the Common Fund, which is designed to finance buffer stocks and improve competitive positions. but progress toward the Common Fund has been slow, if at all, and it is particularly awkward owing to the continuation of a philosophical debate about the free market. Yet here, as with the International Wheat Agreement, negotiations for which have been suspended for more than 2 years, FAO is certain that systems can be devised to protect both market principles and do this without punishing the poorest countries. Along with a lack of progress on developing rules for general trading systems, numerous protectionist tariff and non-tariff measures still hamper the export of primary commodities and the manufactured products from developing countries. The rules of international trade are being twisted more and more frequently, but it is simply not in the interests of the rich countries to force third world markets to close for lack of means of payment that only their export earnings can provide. The underdeveloped countries of Africa, Latin America, and Asia represent almost unlimited potential markets, markets which the rich, developed countries need to recover from the present recession. But to be trading partners, the developing countries need to be solvent. In this recital, I have not attempted to focus attention on the action of FAO. It, indeed, the whole of the international development system, is a bit player on the stage, and it would not help the discussions that you should have for the rest of the day to focus on the actions or the sins of omission or commission of either the whole of the international community or of FAO. I feel that its role, while a modest one, is a good one. Through its regular budget and through funds in trust which government give it for development work, and from the UN Development Program, FAO has at any given time between 2,500 and 3,000 technical advisors in developing countries, helping them to modernize, working with farmers and governments to increase yields, introduce new crops, teach fertilizer use, machinery maintenance, have generated commitments totaling some $20 billion for investment in third world countries. In general terms, the field activities of FAO mobilize about $3 billion annually. No doubt, FAO could easily double or treble its field work if resources were made available. Many governments do express their support for the organization and appreciation for its work by specifically putting national funds in trust with FAO for additional work. The Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians have used this as a significant diversion of their national development funds for many, many years. The oil-rich countries quickly set up special trust funds for FAO's use, led by Saudi Arabia. And most recent addition to that list is FAO's own host country, Italy, which, despite its own enormous economic and political difficulties, has negotiated a $100 million trust fund for FAO's use in extending technical assistance to the developing countries. But the purpose of your discussions today is not to examine the work of FAO, whatever its role, but to debate and to reach positive conclusions for effective political action on world food conditions. So while it would be a pleasure to dwell on the work of FAO, it is not at issue today. What is at issue is our responsibility. We see clearly that unless present trends are reversed, misery and hunger will inexorably spread. Hunger will destabilize regimes, make or break alliances, and fan conflicts. It is, above all, a political problem, and it must be treated as such. For as long as hunger is rife, peace and stability are not possible. World Food Day is an opportunity to review progress, to assess the direction of action, and to consider new commitments to action in the year ahead. It is an opportunity for public education on hunger issues and solutions. I applaud the World Food Institute for its contribution in this continuing search for right solutions and actions. I know that your work today will help people in their understanding of the needs of the developing world and in the creation of that political will required for positive action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weitz, for your thoughtful, clear, and concise description of the issues which we need to address today. I'd like to give the audience a chance to ask a few questions just before you leave. I know you have a tight schedule and need to leave for Des Moines, where you'll catch an airplane for the West Coast, where you'll deliver the same message, I take it, to several other audiences. However, if the audience does have a question, we have a few minutes that we could allocate to that. Yes, Mr.
Very simple first. Does he have this as a paper that we can see? I think if we really need it, there's actually
Well, that's very kind of you. I have a copy of it,
Oh.
which I'd be very glad to leave with Charlotte if it would be of any value for you to have it here. I would
We-
be very pleased to do that.
We-
That's very generous, thank you.
We could reproduce it for the people who leave their names and addresses.
It is not copyrighted.
Thank you. Thank you. We would be glad to have that because there are many things. Yes, Dr. Barron.
We produce a tremendous amount of food in Iowa. This is continually emphasized. And yet, from the standpoint of feeding people of the world, this food is basically assistance to rich people rather than poor people. Our yellow dent corn is a very valuable feed for animal food, but not for human food. Our soybeans also are not especially usable for feeding the poor. Would we be better in Iowa if we would attempt some way to subsidize the production of rice in areas that could be used for producing rice, and high lysine white flint corn instead of yellow dent corn that is a food that people would eat in such countries? May I ask your thinking on that?
One thing that one can always be certain of when questions start is that they are never simple. And that's a good one to start on. My offhand reaction would be to say very straightforwardly and simply, no. That the world issues that we're looking at are more complex than would be solved by that kind of a substitution or shift in production, even if you could accomplish it. I don't think on a world balance anyone is arguing that there is too much of what is being done, because total supplies, even if there were some magical way to distribute them, would not solve the world hunger problem for more than about 30 to 60 days. I mean, bringing everyone up to a minimum adequate diet, assuming you could translate all this. So it is not underproduction which is the problem, nor is it I think the maldistribution of production in terms of a type of crop. So very simply, I would say no. I don't think that is going to provide any solution, and I don't recommend you start it as a political campaign.
Yes.
Well, the tourism of world food issue, as you mentioned earlier in your talk, is the simplicity of technical problems. But then on the other hand, the other side of that is the complexity of the social, political, and economic dimensions of the problems. Now, however, when we look at most of the development projects, it seems that they have focused or pay more attention to the technical aspect than analyzing the social, political, and economic dimensions of the problem. Why is that?
Let me illustrate it by telling a little story. The first Director General of FAO was a marvelous, craggy-browed old Scotsman named John Boyd Orr, later Lloyd Boyd Orr. And he presented to the first conference of the Food and Agriculture Organization a plan that was so brilliant in its simplicity as to what should be the role of the Food and Agriculture Organization. A center for information, statistics, world research, and so on and so forth. Production, an all-out drive for production. A security system. He had the temerity to suggest a bank, a world bank of food that the organization would own, and a couple of other things with it. It was so brilliant, it was so clear, it was so incisive, that what did governments do but to fire John Boyd Orr? They simply didn't renew his contract, to put it in a more graceful and elegant way. And they reduced the Food and Agriculture Organization to an impotent technical body whose voice governments could listen to, because it never said anything that disturbed them. It took 2 decades for that to begin to change. And may I say that the time that the Directors General of the Food and Agriculture Organization get into the most trouble is when they insist on talking policy issues with governments. It's a very painful and very difficult process. But at another level, it is not the easiest thing in the world to, no matter how good your relations are, no matter how personally you may get along with someone, to begin to discuss internal changes that are required. For let's not gloss over the fact that in order to implement even some of the most obvious and simple of the technical changes that are required, enormous social and economic changes are required in third world countries. It is not alone the rich that have to change their thinking and their habit patterns, but dozens and dozens of the third world countries have got some very painful social revolutions on their hands. To contain those and to cause them to move in a way which allows them to ingest improvements technically and economically without blowing up their societies is a delicate balance for a political leader. And therefore, it's not only at the international level do you find this unwillingness to face the issue and to make decisions, but you also find it nationally within countries. And there's no point in arguing that if the rich were simply to unzip their pocketbook and make all the money available that is theoretically required in the prospective plan, the problem would be solved. It wouldn't. You cannot solve the problem by just throwing money at it. On the other hand, that's no excuse for non-action, because many of the countries simply cannot move without a great deal more help than they are getting now. That's a lot of embroidery around the question, but it ain't easy to get people to change socially and politically.
You commented that foreign aid was a must, and I am curious to know what the current status is of the United States and their commitment versus their pledge versus their actual commitment of funds.
I really don't know. The last I heard, FAO wasn't even, the United States government wasn't even going to pay its contribution to the FAO budget. But they certainly have cut their pledge to the United Nations Development Program, which is the biggest multilateral program. That their pledge is down by something between 20 and 25%. Because of the United Nations cut, the IDA is down. I think, if I am not mistaken, that the general level of available foreign assistance is substantially off, but I cannot give you the exact figure. But certainly I know it has hurt the international community very directly and very quickly.
I might add that Dr. Kimmel told me a couple of weeks ago that we're not only not pledging as much, but we're not paying it until the fourth quarter, and that's even worse because they don't have
Our cash flow problem is pretty severe.
Did I see another hand? Yes.
The World Bank, in its latest annual report, has taken many of the African countries to task because of what they term very poor economic conditions that the governments have set for the local producers in those countries. Does FAO, have you taken any position, or have you looked at this aspect of the problem?
You mean the specific World Bank proposal or the general proposition?
The annual report that they just published this past August.
I can't tell you whether we have. I presume we have, since I think we get along fairly well with the World Bank. But certainly on that general proposition we have. In terms of credit, of marketing, of price to trade for primary products. This has been part of the whole lexicon for a long, long time. and is, coming back to the question of the political issue, part of where we continue to get into trouble with governments because of the need to argue that unless there are major changes in the way they are facing their own internal production problems, they will never succeed, no matter what they do technically. But I do not know specifically on the latest World Bank thing. I am, as your chairperson was kind enough not to report, I am a delightfully relaxed and retired international civil servant, and therefore I tend to be a month or two behind on what is going on some of these things.
Did you have a comment, Mr. Robertson?
Your answer